A very good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Unfortunately, I didn't understand any of this, but I'm sure it was entertaining. I would like to pick up something that the previous speaker was just talking about or introducing, which had to do with this idea of architecture being an introverted guild, which I find really interesting because, especially in the context of participation and the question of the role of the architect today, this is something that, at least in this panel, I think will be something that we will really be discussing. But I think we should probably start with the question of participation per se and what we really mean by talking about participation today. Because quite often it has been understood in the last 15 years as something with a rather kind of romantic edge. And especially in artistic practices and architecture, it has been a topic that has been explored since the early 90s. What we on this particular panel will be interested in doing today is looking at architecture as something that can also be practiced without mandate, i.e. without someone coming up to you and asking you to do something, without being commissioned, but in a more kind of proactive way of understanding the profession or the role of the architect. And also the idea of maybe trying to redefine architecture as something that could be called critical spatial practice. The role of the architect as we know it, or as we're kind of used to it, is of course to think of him or her as a designer, but also, of course, it has many other dimensions, including that of a facilitator, instigator, conductor, mediator, curator, at times politician, but also, and most importantly, I think the question of when one actually enables and when one disables, and how this act of disabling can actually also be something productive. The tools within this kind of set of knowledges are very wide-ranging. They would, from my point of view, include things like architectural theory, urban planning, policy, a very important one, contemporary art, social studies and sociology, political philosophy, curatorial practice, activism, and most of all, and also specifically what we will see through the work of the three individuals or groups that we'll be presenting today, the idea of practice-based research. So where do we draw the line between what one would conventionally call research and what one would conventionally call kind of architectural practice as we know it? And in that context, I think it's very important to also rethink the notion of practice as one that is based on consensus versus one which also thinks about dissensual practices, i.e. one that is not necessarily based on practices of consensus, and conflict as a productive mode within that. In the last 10 years, or at least since the end of the tail end of the 90s, there has also been a certain tendency within politics, especially under New Labour in the UK and in Holland with the Dutch so-called polder model, to really, from my point of view, misuse the idea of participation as a tool for political legitimization. And I think what some of the speakers will try to do today is to show that participation can also mean that instead of thinking of it as a kind of romantic mode of participation, i.e. you're all coming around a table to discuss a certain topic, it can also mean a very proactive kind of first-person, singular, individual mode of action. So where rather than you're trying to get everyone together to consensually agree on a particular subject, you as an individual would proactively go out to try to change certain realities. And that, of course, has to do with the question of responsibility. So to which extent do you actually assume that responsibility? And also then, to which extent do you think through questions of authorship? i.e., are you still going to be the kind of single-handed individual that will, develop or design certain buildings, let's say, if we talk about architecture in a kind of physical way? Or what does that mean in terms of collaborative practices and approaches? And of course, the question of agency. And in that context, I think it's also very important to really rethink this idea of the architect as good doer. So what does that really mean? Is that a kind of very romanticized notion? Or can that actually be something that becomes productive? And I think this will be something that the speakers will be talking about. There's a German word which is called Einmischung, which I think is very interesting in this regard, because rather than participation in a kind of romantic way, it talks about the idea of a very proactive practice, about getting involved and an engagement as a productive irritant, which means that participation then actually becomes a kind of single-handed forced entry. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it always has to be necessarily democratic, but that it becomes a kind of very proactive way of practicing. The protagonists of this particular panel this morning, not tonight, will be Teddy Cruz, with whom we start, Doina Petrescu and Konstantin Petku, and Eyal Weizmann. I'm sure you've heard about all of them. They're amazing in what they do individually and collaboratively in many groups and projects over the last 15 years. I'm not going to introduce them individually now, because you all have a little leaflet which gives you a very detailed description of what they've been doing. There's a very strict time limit today, unfortunately, so we'll try to get as much time for the discussion as possible. Just one thing that I would like to add is that tomorrow Eyal will also be giving a talk here, if I understand it correctly. So the times for the presentations today are quite limited. So if any of you are interested to hear more about Eyal's project, you can see him speak tomorrow. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Teddy Cruz and hand over the mic to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.